There comes a moment in every relationship where that other person becomes real. Now, I don't mean to suggest that just because you think of somebody makes them appear, or that if you don't think of them, that makes them disappear, though that would be helpful sometimes, wouldn't it? But I mean, in every relationship, there comes that moment where that person really becomes finally real. They move from just being something you see, like a chair or a table, toward actually being a person with existence that has meaning to you. I mean this, men, do you remember when your wife told you that she was expecting or that you were expecting? You remember that? Maybe you passed out right after that. I don't know. Maybe you don't remember that. But there comes that moment where even you as a woman know that your body has been taken over by this alien thing and changes everything about you, that even then it doesn't become real until the doctor hands that little one over to you, that little Winston Churchill. And then from there, you have to take care of them. Don't all babies look like Winston Churchill to you? Even the girls kind of even do that some kind of, I know your baby was more beautiful than mine, I know that, but they all look like Winston Churchill to me. In fact, as a pastor, you know, sometimes you say, they show you this little baby and you're supposed to say something nice, you know, like that's a beautiful baby, but sometimes that's just a lie. And so, you know, sometimes I just have to say, hey, that's a baby. You know, of all the babies I've seen, that's one of them. Yeah, that's a baby, right? But that person becomes real to you. Yeah, you knew that you were expecting, and you knew one day the day was going to come. You knew that things were going to change, but it doesn't become real until they place that little one in your arms, and you take them home, and you go, now what? Right? Or maybe you've know somebody and you know their face, but you don't know their name. Or maybe you learn their name, and that person moves from just a person in the background to a person that you recognize and are able to say that cool thing, hey, what's up? Right? Because you don't know what their name is, and so you can't call them by name. So you say, hey, good to see you, glad that you're here. Happened to me just the other day at Lowe's. I'm at Lowe's because that's what men are supposed to do, go to Lowe's. I don't know why I'm there, but I'm there because I'm just walking around, so I have no idea how any of this stuff works. But there I am, you know, buying something manly like light bulbs or something. And this guy comes up, and I recognize him, and it takes me a second to recognize him. Okay, I know him, where I know him from. Hey, what's going on? How you doing, man? Oh, that's good. Everybody's man. You know that in this kind of culture. So you do that, and so you recognize that person from out of the group or out of the background to where they have some kind of meaning to you. They move from just the background of all the other people that are there in the crowd, they become that one face that you see out of all the crowd. Then there's that next moment when that person is not just a face to you in an unfamiliar area, but that person has some kind of emotional connection to you. And it's good to see them out of the crowd because not are they just a face, not are they just a person, but they're somebody close to you, somebody that you love, somebody that you have an appreciation for, somebody that you have a value for. We picked up our kids from camp just yesterday, and there's always that fun, chaotic moment of camp of looking through all of the children and all of the parents, and then you're trying to find yours, right? You know that kind of moment when you're trying to see that person, or maybe your husband's going to pick you up from the store, or maybe there's some other moment that you're looking, and go, aha, that's the person, and there's an emotional connection. You know what I'm talking about? It's when those moments when that person becomes real to you. Well, what I'm hoping for is that over the next few weeks, that relationship, that connection that you have with God changes. Where for some of you, God is not just the figment of your imagination or just your kind of thoughts about who He might be, but that God might really become real for you. And then for many of us who know God and have some kind of relationship with Him, that we'll move from that separation of just a person that I recognize, that I kind of know who they are, or I've seen them before, or I might know their name, that God might move from that to really being that intimate connection. Well, you're able to connect with God in a way that you love Him, and there's an emotional attachment there. And wherever you are in that process, wherever you are in that journey, my hope is that over the next few weeks, that we take a step toward that greater intimacy where God becomes more and more real to us. Now, how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to do that by going through a quick little series, maybe 4 weeks, maybe 6 weeks, of trying to understand who God is by examining the names of God. Because in the Hebrew culture, your name meant something. It meant something about your character. It meant something about who you were. Today, we just want to make the names rhyme with the last name, right? Or to make them cute. Or maybe we choose a family name, and so you have to go by your middle name because somebody chose a family name for you. And so you got to go by a middle name. But for the Hebrew culture, the name meant a lot. It revealed who you were. In fact, in the Old Testament, the names were so important that occasionally God would change somebody's name from what they were to what he saw in them or what they were going to become. Abram in the Old Testament became who? Abraham, or whom? I don't know which one is right. But he changed his name from Abram to Abraham. A guy by the name of Jacob, which meant hill grabber, his name was changed into what? Israel, the name that is going to be the people's name of God's people. Even in the New Testament, the names were changed. It went from Saul to what? To Paul. So God is always concerned about names, and when he gives his name, it is not just a way for us to call him something, but it is a revelation of who he is. And so what we want to try to do over the next few weeks is to examine some of these names, particularly the names that God calls himself. Not just the names that somebody else ascribes to him, but the names that God reveals himself to be, or the names that he uses. Try to examine those so that we get a better understanding of his character, of his nature, and who he is. So if you've got your Bibles, we're going to do that by taking our first name in the book of Exodus, chapter 3. Now, when we come to the book of Exodus, chapter 3, we've got to know that several things have happened between there and where we pick up the story. Last week we talked about the story of Joseph, and this was a guy that God called out. He happened to be a son of Jacob, or Israel, and Joseph had a really tough time in life. God had a plan for him, but those promises weren't revealed immediately. It took a full lifetime for those to come to fruition. But the story of Joseph tells us how God's people end up into the land of Egypt, which sets up today's story. Because in today's accounts of what's going on, and when I say story, I don't mean fictional fairy tale, I mean accurate, true story, things that really happen, that when we come to this chapter, what has happened is all of Joseph's family have moved to Egypt, and they have had the best of everything. Pharaoh had honored them, and they got all kind of stuff, and they grew, and they grew, and they grew, and they grew, until there were a lot of Joseph's family. At the same time, time has passed, and the Pharaoh is not so inclined to feel like he owes Joseph's people anything because it has been years and years and years. And yes, the Pharaoh knows, yes, Joseph came, and he kept us from dying because he told us about the story of the cows and the big cows and the skinny cows and how there's going to be profit, then there's going to be famine, and I know he did all that for us, but that was a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, and nobody really cares anymore, and now there are too many of Joseph's family, the Hebrews or the Israelites, and now we're afraid of them, so we're going to put them into slavery because we can use them to our economic advantage. See, this economic advantage thing is not new to us. Mankind is always looking to exploit another person in order to accomplish more money, more funds, and so that happens to the Israelites. In fact, the Egyptians are so strong on the Israelites that they enslave them, beat them, make their life just miserable, so much so that all of God's people, all of Joseph's descendants, call out and cry out and say, send somebody to get us out of this mess. And so God, through a unique set of circumstances that you can read about, don't have time to go through all the story, develops this man named Moses, who is a Hebrew, an Israelite, and he gets adopted in the Pharaoh's family and grows up within that family, and it looks like he's going to be the one to lead the people out of their difficulty. But he gets frustrated one day seeing an Egyptian beat up on an Israelite, and he kills him, and he becomes afraid because of that, and so he leaves for years and years and years and years, and he feels like that the world is over, that he's not going to be able to do anything until one day he is watching his flocks of his father-in-law. See, life got so bad he had to work for his father-in-law. That's tough, isn't it? And so that's what he's doing for a living. He's watching all of the sheep, all the lambs, all the goats, whatever they're watching, until one day, as he's doing this, a day like any other day, an ordinary day, where the sun comes up, the sun goes down, everything's happening the way it's supposed to be, and he sees on the distance a bush, a tree, that catches on fire, and it does not go out. You remember the story now, right? And so there is this bush that is burning, and this guy named Moses looks at that and says, well, that's odd, that's strange, there's nothing else going on today. Sheep stay here for a moment, I'm going to go check that out. And so he walks over to this bush that's burning, that's not consumed. It continues to burn. And if that's not strange enough, which is pretty strange, then the bush talks to him. Okay? It's all in your Bible. The bush talks to him, but it's not really the bush talking. It's the angel of the Lord, who we know from the New Testament is a theophany, or an appearance of the incarnate Christ before he came as Christ. And the bush talks to him and says to him, Christ talks to him, says to him, hey, here's what I want you to do. You're going to go back and lead the people out of bondage, out of the authority of the Pharaohs, and you're going to go do that. And Moses is thinking, I tried that. It did not work. Has God ever asked you to do something that you've already tried and it doesn't work? If you hadn't, you're not trying much for God. Because that happens sometimes. And so Moses says, okay, I'm going to go back and ask the Pharaoh to let all of the Hebrews go, all of the Israelites, all of your economic engine. I'm going to stroll into Pharaoh and say, hey, why don't you let all your slaves go? I got that part. But when I talk to the Israelites, what am I supposed to say to them? And here we are picking up in verse 13. Verse 13 says this, Moses says to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and I say to them, he's not so much concerned about Pharaoh, interesting enough, he's more concerned about what the Israelites are going to say. When I go back and say to them, Israelites, and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name, then what shall I tell them? Because you got to think about this for just a moment from Moses' perspective. He's going to stroll into town, gather up all the Israelites, and said, hey, I was out the other day talking to this burning bush. And the burning bush said to me to go to Pharaoh and say, let my people go. The Israelites will go, right. You were what? You were talking to a bush. Great, got it. And the bush was what? On fire and it wasn't consumed. Great, right. What was the name of the bush? Moses goes, they're going to ask me a tough question. And the tough question is, what is the name of this God who says to free you, to follow me? Then what shall I tell them? And then God answered him and said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. Now, I don't know if that's encouragement to Moses or not, because he's asked the name of the God, and the God gives him a verb. Names are not verbs, right? Now, maybe if you're a Native American, you may have a name that is an adjective with a noun, like a running bear or something like that, you know, or whatever those kind of things are. But he is now supposed to go and to give the verb, and we'll talk about what this verb means. And so he's going to go to the people and say that I am, or the state of being, the to be verb, has sent me to you. The story gets better and better for Moses. And God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, notice capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. And why you and I should be concerned about this is for this reason. This is my name forever. The name by which I am to be remembered from generation to generation. Now, if that's important for us, then I've got to do a little bit of work in the Hebrew. And I know most of us are not Hebrew scholars, and my Hebrew is going to come translated through a southern Arkansas background, so don't expect to be able to communicate to any Hebrew person by what I'm going to tell you today. But when you look at this passage, there are several things that are in play related to the name of God. Okay? So you got to hang with me for just a minute. I will make some points, and it will come together, I promise you. But when you look at this passage, what I've done, all the verses we've looked at, I've kind of crunched down into one slide. And the concept of God is used 3 different times on this slide. The word in yellow is the word God, and that word in yellow is the same word in the Hebrew every time it's in yellow on your screen. And the word for I am is obviously in red, and then this word, the Lord, is in green. So here's what I want to unpack for you very quickly. I want to kind of explain to you this 3 usage of the name of God as we're talking about this revelation of God to Moses. First off, when you look at the word God in yellow, this is actually what you would see in the Hebrew. A couple of things about Hebrew. They use funny characters, don't they? They just kind of use little squigglies. That's pretty tough enough. But the Hebrews also read right to left instead of left to right. Talk about messing you up. That will mess you up, right? So you have to read this word from the right to left, and this word, when you pronounce it, when you look at these different letters that are there, that is the word Elohim, or the word for God. It is a general term for God. It can mean God capital G. It can mean God little g. In fact, when they're talking about false gods, they will say Baal, which is Baal, which is really a letter or a sound that's a stop in the Hebrew, and then this word El, these first two letters of God, to mean God. So this is a generalized term for God that's often used in the Hebrew just to refer to generic kind of God. Anytime you want to talk about God, you can use this word Elohim. But when you come to the phrase, I am who I am, that phrase that's in red, again, you can see the yellow, Elohim, every time, general term for God. When you come to the red here, we're not talking about Elohim, but we're talking about this phrase, okay? And this phrase, when it means I am who I am, is closely pronounced, or at least we do in South Arkansas, Haya Asher Haya. What does that mean? Well, aha, asher, aha is a combination of two imperfect verbs with a relative pronoun in the middle. Okay? Now, why do I tell you that? Well, it's really, really important because this is the name that God has given from generation to generation forever. So what does that mean? Well, a relative pronoun is not a pronoun that has relations with nouns, has nothing to do with that. It's not in the same family. But a relative pronoun is any word like that, who, which, or where. So when you look at that, there's a possibility, because Hebrew is a more archaic language, that there's letters that fall out. It's just a kind of a strange thing, that could really mean any one of those. And on either side of that relative pronoun are these two imperfect verbs, which don't mean that they don't look quite pretty, but an imperfect verb is one of two tenses in the verb tense in Hebrew. Now, quickly, in English, we have tenses in English that are related verb-wise to time. We have the past, we have the present, and we have what? Future in English. And so past was that, I cut the tree down, I am cutting the tree down, or I what? Will cut the tree. All of our English has to do with time. In the Hebrew, when they talk about verbs, they don't talk about time, they talk about action. And for them, they have perfect or imperfect. All of this makes sense in a moment. Let me tell you why. Just a second. Hang with me. I know some of y'all are enthralled. I can tell. I can look at that. You were wishing that you were paying attention in Hebrew class, right? Or at least English class, that you know what I was talking about, right? Well, there are two different kinds of tenses, and those are the perfect tense, which refer to a completed action. And the imperfect verb talks about an incomplete action. Has nothing to do with when these happened in time. It just talks about whether the action was finished or whether the action was not finished. Does that make sense to you? It's a little different way of thinking of that. It's really, really important to understand that. But then when you look at the verb itself, not just the imperfect verb, but the imperfect verb itself is the state of being to be. It's the to be verb in our language. It talks about being. Am, is, are, was, were, be, being what? Been, right? All of that is tied up into this one little phrase, so that when you come to try to translate that phrase, you are given a couple of different options. You can say, I will be, or I am, or I usually, or I might, or I would. All of those are imperfect forms of that. And so when translators have come to the English, what they have chosen to do is to translate that I am who I am. What it means is that I have more to do. I am not the finished God. I am not the completed God, not in the sense that He's going to get better, but I still exist, and I'm going to exist. It does kind of talk about time, and we'll talk about that at the end, but it more has to do with action. And so Moses comes to God asking me, who is it that should say that I was sent by? And God says, you are to give them an imperfect verb of the state of being related to a relative pronoun by another imperfect verb of to be. And we translate that I am who I am. Now, I think there's a better translation than that. That you can also translate that I will be what I will be. In fact, when you translate it, you can translate one imperfect verb in one way and another imperfect verb in another way in the same sentence. Hebrew is crazy. So you could say, I am who I will be. Or I will be who I am. There's lots of different ways to look at this, and I'm going to tell you from the context which one I believe. But notice again that that's just in the red, because at the end of that, he says, this is what you are to say to the Israelites, Hayah, I am, has sent me to you. But then notice there's another word in there. Maybe you can't tell the green from the yellow, but there's this phrase for the Lord. I promise you, I'm going someplace. Stay with me. It's worth it, okay? Don't give up on me. Hang in there, all right? Hang in there. I should have to put more pictures up here, shouldn't I? Or some puppies or kittens or something that would draw your attention. But hang in there with me. The Lord is this green. Well, that word for the Lord is this word. And this word is a word that is not pronounceable by the Hebrews. It is the sacred word of God, so that you're not even supposed to pronounce it. You and I have chosen to pronounce it for the word Yahweh, is the way that we translate this. Now, what's going on with this? Well, Hebrew is a very interesting language that originally when it was written, there were no vowels in the Hebrew. Talk about fun. Can you imagine having an entire language without any vowels in it? The concept was that you would recognize the vowels and you would know how to pronounce it because it was an oral language and we would have heard it over and over and over again. But when it comes to this word right here, and I'll talk more about it in just a second, what they decided to do is they've got to figure out a way to communicate this word. And so a group of people called the Masoretes, beginning in the 7th century and by about the 9th century AD, had come up with a system of sticking vowels into the text. But because the Hebrew language is sacred language, you cannot mess with the original language, so they had to create a way to communicate vowels below each one of the letters, and so they came up with a series of dots and dashes to communicate the vowels that you're supposed to pronounce when you're reading the text. Interestingly enough, because this is a word that was never spoken, this is the name of God, so you don't speak it, they had to invent the vowels that went with that because nobody had ever heard it. All the other words, we'd heard the vowels. This word we hadn't, and so they chose to take the vowels from the word Lord, or Adonai, and put that related to this word, which is where we get the translation Yahweh. Very quickly, what happened was when Yahweh was translated from the Hebrew into the Greek, and then the Greek into the Latin, some of the letters were similar, but they were changed, and so this is really where we get the term Jehovah. Jehovah is kind of a transliterated version of this word Yahweh as it went from Greek to Latin. So the official real name is actually Yahweh. The word Jehovah doesn't appear in the Old Testament. It's the word Yahweh that appears in the Old Testament. Now, why do I say all of that? Well, I say all of that for this. This word Yahweh is called the Tetragrammaton, which means it's 4 letters that we can't pronounce. Okay? That's what it means. It technically means we pronounce it Yahweh just because we've put in some vowel pointings, or what they're called, coming from the Masoretes. But this word, very important, and here's where part of this becomes relevant. This word is a third-person singular noun of the verb Haya. What does that mean? That means God coined a name for himself. He says to Moses, okay, that verb thing's going to be confusing to people. They're not going to catch it. They're not going to understand it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a name, give myself a name, and that name is the noun form of the verb to be, the state of being. That is who I am. And from now on, that is how you are supposed to know me, by this name, Yahweh, which is the noun version, third person singular for God, of the verb Haya. Now, why in the world does any of that make any difference? Well, here's where you can tune in. I think there are 3 things that we can take away from understanding God's name, this one name. One, it determines and demonstrates that God is self-existent. He chooses the one word that talks about the state of being, and he says, I am. He is the only person, creation, created, creator, that can claim that, because the rest of us cannot say that we are or that I am without everything else. Do you realize how much it takes to keep you alive? Do you realize that? I mean, you and I are supposed to eat food almost every day, right? And so some of us don't want to forget that, so we choose to schedule that 3 times a day to make sure that we don't eat, or that we do eat. And if you don't eat, after a few minutes, your stomach grumbles, right? Typically during a sermon, when it's all quiet and everybody's facing forward, your stomach begins to growl. But that growling is letting you know something, that you need to feed me, right? You and I are dependent upon food. If we don't have food, we will cease to exist. Now, for some of us, it may take a few days. Some of us may take a few more days than others because we have more stored up. But at some point, if we don't eat, we will die. If we don't drink water, have liquid in us, that takes a lot less time, doesn't it? You and I also have to be in an environment where we have the right oxygen mix. We've got to have the right air. That also means we've got to be in the right place, that we have the right gravitational pull on our bodies. Too much, we get a little crushed down. Not enough, we float off the planet. We have all of these things that are required for us to exist, and if we don't have them, then we cease to exist, at least in this physical nature. Have you ever lost somebody that was really close to you, and the world kept going and your world was destroyed? But you turn on the news, and those people, they just keep doing news. I mean, your life's in shambles, and your person that you've loved is dead, and you're struggling through all this kind of stuff, and the world just continues. Do you know that when you die, this world will continue? In fact, when we die, for the most part, it won't even be a bump on anybody's radar because the world just keeps on moving. Do you know that if all of us were to die all at one time, do you know that God would still be in business? Do you know if we do finally get the ability to have atomic weapons just on the street that you can just buy, because it seems like everybody's got them now, and we actually blow ourselves up off this planet and this planet cease to exist, do you know that God will still continue to exist? Do you realize that the whole universe, one of those sci-fi movies, could actually come about and we destroy everything in the universe, and God is still going to exist because he is dependent upon nothing? In fact, the New Testament says this about him, that he was, and that he is, and that he's what? Is to come. That's important. And I don't understand this at all, but before anything was, I am. I don't get that. I don't understand that. Before there was anything, you mean before the planet? Yes. Before the universe? Yes. Before time? Yes. God was there at the very beginning. And when it all gets shut down, when it all gets stopped, God will still be there. And that is partially conveyed in this verse, but something else is conveyed in the name of God. And that is this, his permanence. His permanence. That he is a God that will continue to exist from time forever. He is outside of the time. Just like the Hebrew verbs are outside of time, so too is God outside of time. But here's something else. You still got your Bibles out? You own a Bible? Look back at that. The third thing is this, that God is proven. What do I mean by proven? Well, if you don't have your Bibles, I've got it on the screens. I'll cheat for you. But I want you to notice that when God talks about himself, look in verse 15. God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, Yahweh, the Elohim of your fathers, the Elohim of Abraham, the Elohim of Isaac, and the Elohim of Jacob has sent me to you. What does that mean about God's name? It means that God is proven.